Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of your Bish Therapist podcast. I am your host, Melissa Reich, your Bish Therapist, a real life therapist turned pop culture aficionado. Today's episode is going to be a big one. Today, I'm going to talk about Southern Charm and Real Housewives of New York reunion, but coming from the perspective of grief. So as I watch these shows, my therapist brain sees things that, and I make these connections. And when I was watching Southern Charm and Real Housewives of New York, there were grief themes abundantly throughout both franchises in both episodes, and I just thought, wouldn't that be such a amazing topic to talk about? Because grief is hard, and there's no handbook on how to deal with it. And as a therapist, I am really good at dealing with grief personally and professionally. I've had a lot of grief, due to my two cancer diagnoses. I've lost organs, hair, the ability to have children, lots of things. So I am really acquainted with grief. And I think that the best gift that I can give everyone today is to talk a little bit about grief, but in a way of helping us understand it and not fearing it, and maybe how to deal with it. So, I hope you enjoy this episode. It's going to be a long one. First, I'm going to talk about Southern Charm because I personally am obsessed with when anyone goes to therapy on camera. I swear I'm just like entranced in that. I find it so fascinating. I also find it fascinating therapists who, sign releases to have therapy on camera. I think that all I'm going to say about that is, as long as it's in the best interest of the client, of the person, I think it's great. And I think it's been done well. At some points on reality TV, and done really poorly. An example of done really poorly is when Teresa and Joe Giudice saw that, I guess he was a therapist. It was one of the most atrocious things I've ever witnessed. I'm like, that person should really not be doing what he's doing. All therapists are not created equal. That's what I'm going to say. And so sometimes, I watch it and I get a little judgy. I'm human, right? But this Austin meeting with his therapist was fascinating because I picked up what the therapist was saying, and I wasn't sure if that was super apparent to just people watching it. So I definitely want to talk a little bit about it. This episode of Southern Charm, I called it a grief tornado. And honestly, on Real Housewives of New York too, it just seems like the Bravoverse has been really heavy with grief lately. And, I just want to help demystify it, talk a little bit about it, some ways that we can cope. And, that's my goal here, to make something good out of this dumpster fire we call reality TV. So without further ado, let me get right to it. First, I'm going to start with Southern Charm. Because sincerely, every single person on Southern Charm had some sort of a grief arc. At some point this season, there's been a lot of loss of siblings. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of all of that. And I'm going to start with Austin, because Austin, for me and for a lot of people, is, Austin and Shep are tough characters. Because I think really they are kind of caricatures of themselves on the show, but people have a really hard time with them because, they're so, Austin just self-sabotages and Shep is emotionally mature and all these things. But this episode, to me, it gave you a peek behind the curtain as to why they are the way they are, which for me is incredibly fascinating. And to me, the best way to have empathy for behaviors that otherwise are irritating to us is to understand the why behind it. Because when we understand the why, it's easier to have empathy and get, what may be behind some of these behaviors. So I'll start with the scene with Austin talking to his parents before we found out about the death of Olivia's brother. Okay. So, what I want to say is that Austin's parents are legends. I could just tell by the look on their faces. Like, these are the type of people, and again, I didn't grow up in the South, but there does seem to be some cultural considerations in the South in terms of, we don't talk about our feelings. We aren't extremely demonstrative. We are quiet and we are, kind of controlled. And I think that, by the way, if you're from the South or any of, if you have any answers to kind of how the South works or if this resonates with you, please let me know. Um, but I feel that I could just tell by the reaction on Austin's parents' faces, it was just really slight, but that they are just so exhausted by Austin's antics. And, as his dad said, it's a pattern of behavior, right? And so what I wanted to say that I love about Austin's parents is that they they held him accountable while simultaneously supporting him, and that is sincerely, when we love someone, that is the best we can do, right? To say, I love you and I support you, but I'm also going to hold you accountable. And you have to understand this is a pattern of behavior that needs to change. I mean, they couldn't have done that any better, in my opinion. I think it's so important for, I've talked about this before, for loved ones to be honest with us, because so we can't surround ourselves with what I call echo chambers. So echo chambers are people who just will echo your same thoughts, sentiments. And there are people, Teresa Giudice is a great example. She only surrounds herself with echo chambers. Okay. So Teresa doesn't like people saying, maybe you should really think about this. Maybe this was a misstep. So when you surround yourself with echo chambers, it essentially means that your ego defense is you're not ready to be challenged. You're not ready to look at your behavior. And healthy folks welcome other opinions, because if we're doing this thing called life right, we're always learning and always growing, all of us, all the time, until the day that we die. We should always be growing and learning, and never assume that we know it all, because we don't. I certainly don't, and I've been through a lot personally and professionally. But so I think that that's an important thing that I did notice with Austin's family, is that they're not echo chambers for him. They're going to lovingly, supportively hold him accountable. And they did it in such a way that was just so well done. And so I think that's all we can, want to achieve with our loved ones, is to come from a place of care and concern and say, hey, I'm concerned about this behavior. I think that's amazing. So, but what was heartbreaking about it is that, Austin's parents, clearly they're best friends. They've been together for decades, since they were young. And it was heartbreaking watching Austin realize that despite the amazing example his parents set, he is incapable of maintaining friendships with women. And I could tell, he felt extremely shameful, extremely disappointed in himself. And it was just really sad to watch. I felt like, and I'm going to put a term to it that I don't know if everyone listening to this and watching this, if you felt the same way, but when somebody shares their grief with us, we become empathetic witnesses to their grief. And when you're an empathetic witness to somebody's grief, it can trigger a lot of your own unresolved grief. And I mean, I would argue that most humans have experienced grief. I think all humans have experienced it, and most humans are aware of how they experience it, and some are not. So I have this saying that grief begets grief, meaning when we are struggling and we have grief and we have unresolved grief emotions, being an empathetic witness to somebody else's grief and pain can dredge up a lot of stuff for us. And I did see a lot of that happening throughout this episode. So the other thing that I wanted to add that was really just devastatingly beautiful was how Austin's parents, his dad said, our relationship is what got us through Kyle. So for those of you who didn't listen, I did another podcast about this, but for those of you who aren't aware, Austin had an older sister who died tragically when Austin was 8 years old. The family, so Austin, his older sister Kyle, and his parents, they were out on a hike. They had just moved recently, like the week before. They go out on a hike, and Kyle sincerely falls off a cliff and she dies. And Austin was 8 years old when this happened. And in my last episode, I theorized that I guarantee that this did something to his tiny little brain. Because when you're 8, you don't have the cognitive processes that adults do. And I've seen 8-year-olds and little kids do things or have this magical thinking about somehow it was their fault. And so I theorized that Austin, something happened for him there, and it just, the problem is when something like that happens and we don't talk to people and we don't process it and we don't get help around it, in whatever way that looks like, it can become what I call complicated grief. So there's the two things that I'm talking about here. There's grief and then there's complicated grief in varied degrees when we experience any sort of a loss, any loss. Personally, it doesn't always have to be someone dying. Like I said, my losses, with my health issues were, my organs, my hair, my ability to have kids, things like that. Those are really significant losses. It could be loss of a job, loss of a home, loss of a relationship, and the person's still alive. Divorce is a huge loss, right? Even moving to a better place. So Austin, what most people don't understand is that moving prior to the death was also what I believe complicated his grief, because you're moving from your home. And then I think his brain told him something about it. If we hadn't moved here, this wouldn't have happened, things like that. So there was a lot of grief and a lot of loss prior even to his sister's death. But seeing his parents talk about, our relationship got us through, it just truly, it was heartbreaking, but it also warmed my heart, because it does go to show that, there's a way to get through grief, but you have to be, you have to go through it together with your partner, with your loved ones, with whoever, is involved in that process with you. It is a collaborative process. And unfortunately, what happens with grief is sometimes people aren't interested in it. And that's where, marriages and relationships fall apart, right? If one partner wants to pretend this doesn't exist, and then the other partner is just entrenched in their grief, well, that's how divorces happen and people grow apart, or separations, or what have you. So kudos to Austin's parents. They seem to have a lovely relationship. They seem to be a wonderful, supportive parents to Austin, and they just seem to want the absolute best for him. So I wanted to talk about, going back to Austin. So after, we find out that Olivia's brother died, and I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute. Austin, it shows him in the kitchen, and the thing about me is I am not a therapist, but also an empath. So I physically feel people's emotions in my body. And when people have heavy grief, I can feel it in my solar plexus. It's like a burning kind of heavy sensation. It's hard to explain, and it makes me sound like a lady with a tinfoil hat, but whatever the reason, that's just who I am. And when Austin was in the kitchen and he was just sobbing, I felt that feeling, and I could just feel his palpable pain. And to me, it was apparent that in that moment, he was surprised by his feeling. And so part of what I'm here to talk about with grief is to prevent people from kind of feeling surprised by it. Since grief does beget grief, right? And if we don't deal with it, it kind of piles up. So he seemed really surprised. And when we're surprised by things, we feel overwhelmed. And then we believe all of a sudden that we don't have the ability to get through what we're going through. And we just kind of forget all of our faculties. So, when I saw Austin cry, it was apparent to me he really wasn't, he was crying more for himself than he was for Olivia. I think because it brought up, which to his credit, he did acknowledge this, it brought up all his stuff with Kyle. Because I don't care how much therapy you have, I don't care how much you process it, there's no getting over that or past it. All you can do is cope with how you feel as those feelings arise for the rest of your life. Sincerely, that's all you can do. There's no forgetting it, getting past, there's just coping, right? So seeing Austin cry, it just was so abundantly clear. It was the unresolved trauma of his sister. And I think he did feel empathy for Olivia. But to me, what I saw was him experiencing complicated grief. That was more than just grief. That was more than I'm sad for Olivia. That was a deep, wounded sadness that came from his soul. And I'm so happy he did decide to go to therapy because, as everyone knows who listens to this and watches it, and by the way, for those watching, the sun is coming in through my house and it's like blinding me. So pardon me, I'm just doing the best. I really seem to have some awareness in this therapy session about the fact that he completely self-sabotages all his relationships. He has had several women. I assume he was talking about Madison. I assume he was talking about Olivia, that really could have been the real deal for him. And he just self-sabotaged at every turn. And the reason that he does that was revealed in this therapy session. Now, it was very clear to me, so I will tell you what I observed, because I wonder, again, if you're someone who's never been in therapy or hasn't done therapy, if you're not a therapist, it might be hard to have noticed. But the therapist essentially boiled down why Austin behaves the way he does, and it was tragically sad. The reason is twofold. Okay. So the first is that he is afraid to be vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable with someone and you love someone, that means there are possibilities of you losing that person, right? So whether you lose the partner through a breakup or whether you lose them through death, right? If you're with someone until the end of your life, that's, I think so. Essentially, Austin is afraid to love because he's afraid to lose that love. Number one. And number two, the therapist outlined Austin's issues is his own fear of potentially losing a child because of what he witnessed with his sister. And I was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. I had theorized in my last podcast, it was, fear and the vulnerability and all that, but doesn't that make so much sense? So essentially, Austin, if you fall in love and you get married, apparently in the South, I don't know if you have to have children or that's just expected. That's another weird thing I'm not sure about, because you can love someone and not have children. My husband and I don't have kids, and we're extremely happy and we're a family, and that's okay. But it seems like, I don't know, maybe Austin wants kids, or it just seems like it's complicated to him that loving someone means A, possibility of losing that person, and then B, possibility of having a child, and then fear of losing that child. Because in fairness to Austin, I guarantee you what he witnessed, the depth of the grief of losing his sister when he was so young, absolutely was terrifying to him. I guarantee it was terrifying. It was so scary. And clearly his brain, his 8-year-old brain, just equated love to loss. And it makes me sad because ultimately, that's going to keep him really isolated and really lonely and really stuck in this pattern. So my hope is that it's not just for the show and that he really is going to continue with this therapy. Guess what? I always say everyone deserves to be happy, except for really terrible people. But Austin and Shep, they may be douchey, but they're not terrible people. And I do believe that they deserve to be happy. And, unfortunately, sometimes things happen to us, and when we're a child and it doesn't get attended to, but as adults, we are capable of managing that. And for some reason, our brains make us feel like we can't possibly. So if you're listening to this and you're dealing with grief, you can get through this. You will get through it. You can get through it. You are strong enough. You are capable. And, I hope that Austin, we're able to see a little bit more of this process, during Southern Charm. Okay, so I'm going to move on from that. And then I'm going to talk about, Olivia Taylor and Shep. So Olivia's brother was the one who had passed away. He was young, and the thing that confused me about it is her brother had Lyme disease, and they said that the death was related to that, but I know that Lyme disease is it can be treatable, it can be chronic, but it can be treatable. And I actually used to run a support group for people with chronic Lyme, so I do know a fair amount about it, but I've never known anyone to pass away from that. So I don't know if his situation, I don't know anything about the situation. So that's all I'm going to just report on the facts that they reported. And then I'm not sure about the details of how that happened. But I think, the saddest thing with Olivia is just that you could see the pain on her face. When it's like she showed up to film to do her job, and you could just tell she was like, oh my gosh, I can't even believe I have to do this. And you could just, the pain was palpable. The grief was palpable. I just wanted to give her a hug. I cried so much. But it was amazing to see how everyone showed up for her. And, JT canceled his event. Austin made a comfort basket. Shep offered his home. Leva and Vanita had a comfort circle with comfort food. Craig made food. So it's like everyone really showed up for her. And that truly warmed my heart, because sometimes with grief, people get really weird. For lack of a better term, like they don't know how to respond. And so sometimes people think, well, I don't know what to say, so I'm not going to say anything at all. And I think the great thing that Olivia talked about that was really important is that you don't have to say the right thing or do the right thing. Like, just show up. People appreciate people who just show up. But I mean, all of these things are great ideas. If someone's grieving and you're struggling to think of ideas, I love all of these. Comfort basket, well, not all of us can offer our home. We're not all rich, but, I mean, I guess you could offer your home if you're not rich, but then you need somewhere to stay. Anyway, I just think it was equally amazing too to see how Olivia welcomed Taylor and Austin, who were really trying to show their support, but she welcomed it. Excuse me. And it just tells me she's a really loving, beautiful soul. And, I just love Olivia. I love everything about her. I've posted about her before. And, it's amazing. But the one thing that Olivia said that is, I want to go back to what I had said before. She said that her dad hadn't stopped working since it happened. And so that made me, it's normal, right? Especially men stereotypically. And what I'm going to get to is that in the South, it seems like there's definitely emotional suppression that happens. And not only emotional suppression, but it is very stereotypical. Men feel like, well, to be a man, you can't have feelings, you can't feel weak, which is just a recipe for disaster, because feelings are a human experience. There's no gender, and there's no, we all have to feel our stuff. So that is a good example of how Olivia's parents, if her dad doesn't start to kind of be there to support her mom, that could create some issues in that relationship. But listen, their son just died, they're doing the best that they can. So, to be determined with that, but I'm just hoping, they're able to come together and be a support for one another. So I do want to talk about Shep, because Shep also was someone who really, this episode, it featured a lot of his grief about little Craig, which is his dog, who he did name after Craig, which is so sweet. Seeing Shep, seeing how concerned and heartbroken he was about little Craig's health issues, it did restore my faith in him, because sometimes Shep can be so douchey that we forget that he is really a loving, caring, wonderful person. And, this is the reason why, Shep can be so amazing, is that when he's great, he's great. When he's not, he's really not. But here he talked about how little Craig changed his life. He acknowledged that he was really self-focused before. And again, he's so magnanimous, which is a term that I use because Shep has used it. Shep loves some big words, and so do I. But Shep can be very magnanimous and generous when when he wants to. And so offering his home to Olivia's loved ones, I wrote here, he's a disaster with women, but it's a good reminder that he's a good soul. And I think Shep, has his own issues with emotional suppression. That was kind of a theme that I saw running throughout the episode, is that Shep just seems to be emotionally constipated. And so holding in emotions, we have a saying in the program of AA that like stuff will always come out sideways. So if you're stuffing, and you're not coming back to that to unpack it, it's going to explode and come out sideways. And so that's where I think we see the douchier parts of Shep. And I know that's not a clinical term, but it can really describe him pretty well. So I think that is what happens to Shep, is he stuffs his feelings and he then emotionally explodes. And that's, in fairness, that's what a lot of people do. Because in my opinion, watching Shep, he was crying over little Craig, right? But you could tell, I could just tell he was like, okay, I'm going to cry, but I'm not going to cry too much. Like, he tried to have a very controlled and metered response, which I just think is, it's understandable because you're on TV. But I hope that at home he's allowing himself to feel things a little bit more, because there's just nothing good that's going to come of that. Suppression I wanted to talk about is when Patricia was talking to Michael, which, oh my gosh, that really tugged at my heartstrings. So for people who haven't watched Southern Charm, Michael was Patricia's butler. I'm not sure what his title was. He was, he was her right-hand man. He did everything at the house. He made her martinis. They seemed to have this friendship. And 2 years ago, he had a massive stroke, but it was like a weird, very specialized. It was like a neurological stroke. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he was seriously rendered completely. He had to be in a wheelchair. He couldn't talk. He couldn't feed himself. It was devastating. And so he had to go to this assisted living in Florida. And so this was the first time we saw Patricia and Michael talk in FaceTime. He was kind of teaching them how to make his signature martini. And you could just tell it was just really sad. There was so much grief. They missed him. He missed them. And what I found so fascinating is that after the call, basically, Patricia kind of excused Whitney in that polite Southern way. She was like, okay, well, I'll see ya. And I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening to my video right now. And it was like, she kind of dismissed Whitney, and then she just cried quietly in the kitchen and just did like a few sniffs and a few little pat of the paper towel against her tears, like Candace Dillard style, like her cry angle. That she does that little triangle to get her tears. People online call it the cry angle, which I think is absolutely brilliant. So what I wanted to say about that is that I think there is this component of emotional suppression with just everyone. Patricia being afraid to cry in front of the camera after talking to Michael, which is like a totally understandable response. And, Vanita and Leva not wanting to cry in public after finding out that there was a tragic death with one of their friends. Shep holding back emotions. So this stuff comes back to, is this a Southern kind of cultural thing? I know it's a human condition, right? To not want to show emotion. But to me, it's like, well, who cares if you're crying on camera or, like if you cry in response to this, congratulations. It means you're human. It means you have empathy. It means you're experiencing feelings appropriately. I just think that, that's just an interesting thing that I noticed. So, again, if you're from the South or this resonates with you, please do let me know. Okay, so what else did I want to say before I move on? Oh, I did want to say about Taylor. So I think that here's the thing with Taylor. I think that her ego reactions are making her defensive. So, for example, when she was talking to Vanita on the phone and Vanita was like, I don't think you should come. And she just was like, well, no, I know her family and she needs me there. And it's like, I think that was her ego defense. She didn't want to be left out. She didn't want Taylor to think that she didn't want Olivia to think that she was not being there for her. But I think that was more about her. And it was the same thing when Taylor talked to Olivia, like in the kitchen, like 10 feet away from everyone else sitting there. It was because of Taylor's own discomfort. Like she was bursting at the seams to tell Olivia about kissing Austin. And so these are two examples for me of Taylor doing things that aren't good for somebody else, maybe because it suits her or it makes her ego feel better. That doesn't mean she doesn't care. I think it just means that, Taylor clearly has been struggling. Her behavior's been really incongruent with how she presents, which I have to say about that, I don't love the Patricia and I don't love the slut shaming here, because here's what I'm going to say. I feel that with Taylor, is she acting incongruent with how she normally acts? Yes. And is it incongruent with her identifying as a Christian? Yes. But weaponizing somebody's faith and kind of slut shaming at the same time is different from holding someone accountable and saying, this is really incongruent with how you present. And it's hypocritical. It is hypocritical. Her behavior has been hypocritical, but I think it comes from a place because she is struggling. And I talked about grief bonding. And so grief bonding is when you have lost someone really special to you. So we're going to, in this example, use Austin and Olivia. When you lose a sibling, there is a pain to that really you feel you can only be understood by somebody else who has experienced that, right? You feel seen, you feel validated. And so I think Olivia and Austin, they have this kind of grief bond now. They both talked about that. But Taylor also has that grief bond too, because Taylor's sister, it was dealing with ovarian cancer twice. And so they were really concerned, about that. And Taylor's brother did pass away, but it was after. I'm not sure if we're going to see it later on the season because I get confused about those timelines. But I think that at some point we're going to see it. And so to lose a sibling when you're the age that they are and you're all in the same friend group, it does tend to give this grief bond. And so I just wonder how that's going to play out in their relationships going forward. So I'm kind of interested in watching that. So before I move on to Real Housewives of New York City reunion, I wanted to just kind of talk about a couple of things with grief. So why is holding in grief emotions so harmful? There's this book called The Body Keeps the Score that I highly recommend, that, our minds and bodies are one entity. And when we experience grief, depression, things like that, we feel it physically in our body. Somatically, that's just how it is. It doesn't mean you're crazy. It doesn't mean you're not coping. It's just how it's just how it is. We feel these things deeply in our body. And so that book I've read it. It's really great. And it's really helpful in helping us figure out, the mind, body, soul connection and how to, not store emotions in our body and things like that. Because what happens is over time, I have this saying, you get bitter or you get better. And when we have unresolved stuff through no fault of our own, if we don't deal with it, we tend to get bitter. You see people outside who, angry drivers and people at the grocery store that are so rude. It's because they're unhappy. And when we are unhappy and, we're not aware of our stuff, we tend to put it on other people, and that's not fair. But also it's a sign to not take it personally, right? So that was one of my important points. Leva got really frustrated with Taylor when she called and she took it. The problem was Leva took what Taylor said personally. Taylor's stuff was about her own ego and wanting to desperately be involved. So that to me was just a good real life example about how dangerous it can be to take other people's stuff personally. Leva got mad and it's like, that's a waste of your emotional energy because Taylor's doing what she's doing and it has nothing to do with you. And that's how most people are. The driver who cuts you off and gives you the finger at the grocery store is really nasty, cuts in front of you in line. It's their stuff. It has nothing to do with you. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to Real Housewives of New York reunion. I think that for me, I wasn't even going to talk about this. So normally what I do is I do a podcast, but then I also on my Instagram page, I kind of get, when I watch something, I get really interested and I write out some, slides and then I post them on my Instagram page. So I posted on my Instagram page today about some of my thoughts about Real Housewives of New York reunion. And a lot of women really, they said it resonated with them. So I actually am calling an audible. I wasn't even planning to do this, but I'm going to share some of my thoughts about that on this podcast as well. Because a lot of women have reached out to me and talked about, wow, you just summed up 20 years of my therapy in one slide. And I was like, so honored, but also, wow, that's really powerful to me. And so I do want to make sure to use my platform to really be helpful to people. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. For those of you who aren't interested, because everyone does learn differently. So sometimes people aren't auditory learners. And so through listening to this, it's better for some people to see it visually, because there's different types of learning. And so I will, if you're interested in looking at some of my posts, go over to Your Bish there on Instagram and you can see all those posts. You can save them, you can reread them, whatever helps you. So what I'm going to start off with talking about with the reunion, again, I feel like the theme of the New York reunion was complicated grief and childhood trauma. We have these women who have had horrific abuse, horrific childhood trauma and abuse, and they were starved for love by their parents and things like that. And it's rare to see so much of that in one circle. I shouldn't say this. It's not rare to see it. It's rare to hear people openly talk about it. And so I think for some people, maybe it was too much, but for me as a therapist, I was like, oh my gosh, I am here for this. So I'm going to explain a little bit of what I saw and kind of what I wrote. So when we lose a parent with whom we've had a complicated relationship, it can result in complicated grief. The grief process itself is really difficult, but when there are unresolved emotions from childhood trauma, it can make the process even more complex and challenging, right? Because remember, I said grief begets grief. So sometimes if you have a complicated relationship with a parent, you're estranged, you're not talking to them, and then they pass away, people are taken by surprise by their emotions. But it just means you're human, because when you have all this unresolved stuff, your brain and your body, it doesn't have grief buckets, right? Well, it doesn't say, well, this grief was from this, and this grief was from divorce, and this grief is from moving. No. Grief is grief. And our body and our brain, it doesn't care what grief. It will, we can be easily triggered from seeing other people's grief, witnessing, being empathetic witnesses. And the other thing I want to say about grief is that the best way to honor grief is just to be an empathetic witness, sincerely. And, hearing someone, listening to someone, and not encouraging them to stuff their emotions or, stop talking about it. Things like that are truly the best way to honor somebody's grief. To just listen, to just be there. There's no magical formula. Just be an empathetic witness. That's all you got to do. So I'm going to talk about Jenna specifically first, because Jenna's mother, for those of you who are not aware or haven't watched the show, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, it's not called Asperger's disorder anymore. It's the autism spectrum disorder. And I'm going to tell you why Asperger's, we shouldn't say that anymore. So Asperger's syndrome was retired in 2013 from the DSM. And the reason for this is that the man who it was named after, Hans Asperger, he was a Nazi. Oh my God. So I think it took people a while to maybe catch on and be like, okay, we can't. No, this is, first of all, the thought is that Asperger's and autism spectrum disorder are not different. So autism and Asperger's used to be kind of two different umbrella terms, but now it's more autism spectrum disorder. You remember how, I always talk about things really clinically can be viewed somewhere on a spectrum. So part of the reason was, instead of delineating between Asperger's and autism, it's one kind of long scale of behavior, number one, and number two, named after a Nazi. So it's ASD for short, autism spectrum disorder. But because Jenna's mom had those issues, it meant that she was not emotionally capable of meeting Jenna's emotional needs. And it sounded like she had kind of a severe emotional deficit. Not all people on the spectrum are the same. So let me be really clear when I say that, but it sounds like Jenna's mom was just really emotionally unintelligent because of the issues that she struggled with. She wasn't able to meet Jenna's needs. And she was also able to sadly recognize that, which there's a grief in that too, right? So a parent being able to say, well, I know that I can't meet your needs, and I'm telling you that I can't meet your needs, and I'm so sorry, but there's a grief in that too for everybody. And it was through no fault of their own. So, it's just a sad situation. But what I wanted to say is that when Jenna's mom died, she was likely mourning the loss of the relationship she was never able to have, but also the finality of never getting the chance to have it. Because although we may intellectually accept that our parents weren't able to give us the love that we needed, the inner child in us never stops feeling disappointed. It just doesn't. Our inner child is always going to be, as much as you process your trauma, as much as you go to therapy, there's the human part of you that is always going to be disappointed that your parents or parent weren't able to give you the love you needed. I mean, it's just so sad because you do this coulda, woulda, shoulda. Well, if I could have gotten love that I needed, what could I have been? What could I have done? And so it's just dangerous. We cannot play that game. All we can do now is be aware of it and just try to do better. That's sincerely all we can do. But the finality of death can take people who have been estranged from their parents or caregivers. It can take them by surprise. And this is one of the reasons why. So I hope that all makes sense. And if you have questions about it, please, send me a DM. I also have an email, that's my personal email. I have an email, yourbishtherapist@gmail.com. So you can email me with questions, about that. A couple other things I wanted to say is that I like that Sai was held to task about her displaced anger towards Bryn. And I like that she owned it and she took accountability for it. So the thing that I have theorized about Sai the whole season is that she grew up, her mother was an alcoholic, and she was not able to meet her needs or give her the love that she needed, and her mother recently died. Okay, so this is what I'm explaining, is that as much as Sai thinks that she's dealt with it, which I don't think she ever has, I don't know if she said that, but that would just be my guess, that she's never allowed herself to feel these emotions. So when her mom died recently, there's complicated grief that I believe that Sai is experiencing. And Sai has this, so children, adult children of alcoholics, which the abbreviation is ACOA. When you are the adult child of an alcoholic and you've had childhood trauma due to addiction in your family, there are a set of personality characteristics that often go with that. And one of the characteristics is being fiercely protective. So I think Sai, what I see past the exterior, and I think she has a hard armor on to protect herself from being hurt because she was so hurt as a child. And so that makes her seem cold. That makes her seem angry. But I think sometimes she does get angry and she takes it out on people because she doesn't know how to regulate her emotions. And unless, in fairness, we learn how to deal with our emotions based on how our parents did it. How do they deal with it? What do they do when they're angry? Or what do they do when they're sad? So as an adult, sometimes it's painful because we have to relearn, and it feels really frustrating, but I promise you it's really liberating. It's not a complicated process. You just have to be ready to do it. And I just send love to anyone who's dealing with this. I'm an ACOA myself. And so I think that I understand that when you're in your pain and in your grief, your edges can be sharper than normal, because it's like barbed wire trying to protect you. So that's my personal interpretation of what's going on with Sai. And I just have a lot of empathy for her. But, I guess we'll have to see what happens on the next part of the reunion and next season, because this could also just be tough personality characteristics. We'll have to see. Sai said one thing, which this was a part of my practice that I talked about a lot because I find it really important. So Sai kept saying I'm broken, and Jenna kept saying I'm broken. Brynn kept saying they're broken, because when you did not receive the love you need as a child, you do feel broken. You do feel like a misfit toy. And the one thing that I always want to say is, there's a Japanese art of repairing broken, and I apologize if I am butchering that pronunciation. It is Kintsugi. And why I bring that up is because in the Japanese culture, it is believed that repairing broken objects with this gold lacquer, it creates a more beautiful object through the acts of breaking and repair. And I just love that sentiment because it is so true. I feel personally and professionally that sometimes to learn the hardest, most valuable lessons, we do have to break in certain places. But when we repair ourselves, we are stronger at those broken places. And, that's just my view on it. And I just think that humans are so quick to say, well, I'm broken and I should be discarded. And it's like, well, no, just because something's broken doesn't mean it's not wonderful and valuable. We're all a little broken. We're all damaged. We're all, that's called humanity. So I think it's being a little bit easier on yourself if you're feeling some of these emotions, but B, also keeping it in mind, that piece of it, that we are often stronger in those broken places because we have learned and we have healed, right? Okay, so a couple of other things I wanted to say is that Brynn, there was Uba was crying about the loss of her mom, which was very heartbreaking because Uba and her mom, they seem to have such a beautiful relationship. And so it's interesting, to me, what we were seeing up until this point was some complicated grief. And what Uba's experiencing is grief, right? Her mother died. She had a beautiful relationship with her. She missed, but Brynn when Uba was crying about it, she encouraged Uba to stop crying because her mom wouldn't want her to be sad. And while this was well-intentioned, it's problematic, and I want to share why. So it's a conditioned response from Bryn, which the behavior serves to distract and avoid painful emotions, which I imagine Bryn has had to do to survive. Sometimes people who have had such severe trauma, you sincerely have to disassociate to survive because you're just not ready to deal with it. That happens all the time. And so this small little behavior to me was like a huge indicator of Bryn is uncomfortable with her own emotions, so therefore she's uncomfortable with Uba's emotions. And I think that this is one of the reasons that Bryn continues to struggle emotionally, because we have to be willing to feel all of our feelings, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Ooh, some emotions can feel so ugly. There's no bad emotions. There's no negative emotions, not in my world anyway, but it feels so ugly and so painful when you're feeling certain things. The only way out is through. And we have to be confident in our ability to survive the journey. So please, anyone listening to this, you are capable of surviving the journey. I promise you, you are. People will always say, oh gosh, I can't imagine being diagnosed with cancer. How do you deal with that? And then, people said, oh, well, I can't imagine being diagnosed again, having 2 different cancers. And it's like, here's the thing. Grief is grief. Trauma is trauma. It's like we tell ourselves that, oh, I wouldn't be able to survive a cancer diagnosis, like mentally. Well, sure you would. The other option is just giving up. And I don't think that's certainly not in my nature. And if it's not in yours, then start having some confidence in your ability to cope. Because the fact of the matter is we have gotten through 100% of our bad days so far. All of us, 100% of them. Some of our best days are ahead of us, and allowing ourselves to feel things just allows ourselves to be free and to move forward from the shackles of all this pain and grief and trauma. So I know this is a lot, but I'm hoping that it is helpful. So the last thing I'm going to say is that I think what we all witnessed is the pervasive and extensive impact of parental emotional neglect. Bryn, Jenna, and Sai sharing the impacts of being starved for love and affection. It was courageous. It was hard to watch, but it was very courageous. Because when we're being starved for love as a child, it makes us believe we inherently never deserved love in the first place. And I've said this in other podcasts, when our parents don't give us the love we need, we don't stop loving our parents, we stop loving ourselves. So all of us had these little brains that were unable to process things. And when things happened and we didn't get love or we had trauma, it compounds and it gets complicated in adulthood. So to say, I apologize for the heaviness of this episode, but I think that for me, this work is really important to take. I mean, this is exactly why I started this, right? We look at these shows and they can be fun and they can be entertaining, but sometimes there are these real concepts that not only trigger people watching it, trigger the audience, but also it's just hard to watch. And so I think that if I can help somebody through sharing my experience, strength, and hope, and my also interpretations, my clinical interpretations of some of this, then I hope at least that's what I've done today. So I appreciate, thank you to everyone for, continuing to listen, continuing to watch. I will say quickly, for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, I have a very large window in the front of my house, and all of a sudden the sun came in and it just really messed with the picture of it. So I do apologize for that. But if you're just listening to this, you don't even know what I'm talking about. But thank you so much for everyone to listening. Sending love to everybody who is managing this. I am going to, so I mentioned the book, The Body Keeps the Score. I'm going to list a couple of recommendations for some books about inner child healing, grief, things like that. I'm going to post them on my Instagram page. I am not technologically advanced enough to embed it in this video, but I will post it on my Instagram page for people who are interested in, reading some books and, understanding it. I give you a lot of credit. I think self-education is hugely valid. Therapy is not necessarily for everyone or accessible to everyone, but books are. So I'm going to do that shortly. And again, Your Bish Therapist on Instagram, Your Bish Therapist YouTube channel, Your Bish Therapist on TikTok. And if you have questions about anything, and you have, questions for me personally, questions about anything that I've said, you can email yourbishtherapist@gmail.com. So thank you. That's going to be it for me today. And based on everything that I have talked about, I think that, what I always say when I am ending an episode is to just please take care of yourselves and each other and be the light in the world you want to see. Because we're all dealing with stuff that you can't read on our face, you can't see on the outside. We're all dealing with something that people, don't understand or know nothing about. So let's just remember that. Thank you so much. Podcast disclaimer. Posts are not intended to diagnose, treat, or provide medical advice. Your Bish Therapist is for entertainment purposes only. The podcast, my opinions, and posts are my own and not associated with past or present employers, any organizations, Bravo TV, Greyheart Productions, or any other television network. The information in YBT Podcast and on its social media is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat. Please do not act or refrain from acting based on anything you read, see, or hear on YBT Podcast or associated social media. Communicating with YBT via email and or social media does not form a therapeutic alliance. Melissa, operator of YBT, is unable to provide any therapeutic advice, treatment, or feedback.